On January 15, 1919, the residents of Boston, Massachusetts, awoke to a strange sight. Giant molasses-colored waves were crashing through the North End, overflowing the streets and climbing up the sides of buildings before receding just as quickly as they had come. But this was no tsunami. In fact, it was the result of one of the largest man-made disasters in U.S. history. And when the dust, or should I say the syrup, had settled, over 21 people would be dead. So how did this happen? Well, it started several years earlier in 1916 when a Canadian businessman named Henry Davis bought several warehouses near Boston's commercial docks. Davis owned a chain of rum shops and restaurants, and he intended to use the warehouse to store molasses, which at the time was an important ingredient in rum production. The molasses was shipped to him from the Caribbean in giant steel tanks and then pumped into storage vats inside the warehouses. Now, molasses is a byproduct of the sugar refining process. It's what's left after the sugar crystals have been separated from the sugarcane juice. This makes it a lot thicker than water, kind of like honey. And while it's perfectly safe to eat, it's not exactly pleasant to be around. Imagine the stickiest, thickest caramel you've ever seen. That's what the residents of Boston were about to discover. It turned out that Davis hadn't realized how close his new business would be to the city's main water supply. So as soon as the molasses started arriving, complaints began pouring in from local residents about the stench coming from the warehouses. Not to mention the fact that giant molasses vats weren't exactly the safest thing in the world to have near Boston's busy waterfront. If there was a fire or an explosion, it could cause catastrophic damage. In response, the city council passed a law requiring all molasses shipments to be offloaded at night so the stench wouldn't be as noticeable. They also ordered Davis to build safety valves into his molasses tanks to prevent explosions. Unfortunately for the people of Boston, these measures didn't go far enough. In January of 1919, a tank started leaking. It wasn't clear if it was a small leak or a big one to the people living nearby, only that something was wrong. At first, the leak seemed like it could be contained. A worker arrived to find molasses spurting out of the tank at about the height of a man. He tried to stop the flow with a wrench, but he couldn't get a good seal because the molasses was so thick. By the time he finally managed to turn off the valve, it was too late. The molasses had spread into the streets. What happened next has become known as the Great Molasses Flood. As the molasses surged through the North End, it reached depths of nearly 10 feet in some areas. Homes and businesses were completely submerged. Waves crashed over streetcars and swept them away. Molasses sloshed up the sides of buildings, coating entire city blocks in sticky syrup. To make matters worse, many of the buildings in the North End were made of brick, which absorbed the molasses and made it even harder to clean up. It took weeks for the city of Boston to remove all the molasses from the streets, and even then, they had to use giant pumps to do the job. But as you can imagine, there was much more damage than just ruined bricks. Entire sections of pavement were ripped up and thrown into the air before landing on nearby rooftops. Debris from destroyed homes and businesses floated down the streets like driftwood in a flood. Cars were crushed, street lamps were snapped, barrels were overturned, and thousands of gallons of molasses were spilled into Boston Harbor. It's a wonder that more people weren't killed. Though it's believed that as many as 21 people lost their lives during the flood, most of the damage occurred while the people of Boston were asleep. A few factory workers who were too busy working in the shipyards nearby never even saw the wave coming until it was too late. One of the victims was a 7-year-old boy named Bertram Colton. He woke up when the molasses hit his house and he ran to the window to see what was going on. But before he could warn his family, the entire 3rd floor collapsed and buried him under tons of bricks and molasses. There were other close calls as well. Several people had to be rescued from rooftops after the molasses reached dangerous levels, and a group of firefighters who responded to the disaster ended up stuck in a warehouse when the roof collapsed. In the aftermath, the people of Boston were understandably furious. They blamed Henry Davis for knowingly putting them in danger and demanded that he be held accountable for the damage. Davis, on the other hand, argued that he had done everything he could to prevent the disaster. He had followed the city's safety guidelines and installed the necessary valves in his molasses tanks. What happened, he claimed, was an act of God. A jury ultimately agreed with him. The judge in the case ruled that Davis could not have reasonably foreseen the damage that would be caused by a single tank leaking, and so the people of Boston were left to deal with the consequences on their own. However, there was one unexpected benefit to the disaster. Molasses, it turns out, is great fertilizer. In the months following the flood, gardens and farmlands around Boston flourished like never before. Some people even claimed that their fruit trees bore 3 times their usual crop of fruit, thanks to the extra molasses in the soil. Today, you can still see the effects of the Great Molasses Flood in Boston. Several buildings are stained brown from the molasses that covered them, and there's even a memorial to the victims of the flood near the site of the disaster. Every year on January, the people of Boston remember the Great Molasses Flood as one of the strangest disasters in American history. It's a story that's been passed down for generations, warning us of the dangers of big business and the importance of safety regulations. I sure hope you enjoyed this episode of Fake History. If you did, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your ideas for future episodes. I can't do any of this without you guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.